So let me start my talk on a positive note. I totally messed up my career. At least that's what my friends say. That's what all the headhunters said. And the even worst thing about it is I did it on purpose. So that was me. Some month ago, I was flying private jet together with my 87-year-old self-made billionaire boss. I learned tons of things from. We invested more than 500 million euro into the German startup and ecosystem. We invested most of the flagship startups from Munich and from Berlin. I always wanted to be a big investor, and after 20 years of really trying, I achieved. The last thing I did was a 2.8 billion euro take private of our largest holding. So I was at the peak of what I ever thought could be possible for me, because I always thought that I'm a quite regular guy. I have never been really good in school. I have never been good at university. But once I achieved all the things I thought would be important to me, I felt the quiet discomfort of having arrived. Meanwhile, I was the chairman of a company which was struggling. It was Mr. Specs, a lot of growth since beginning, not too much profitability, a lot of cash burn, and in 2021, we really struggled. So we IPO'd the company on a valuation of roughly 750 million euro. Then we had the tech crunch, then we had a profit warning, and we finally ended up at 1.50 euro. When I became chairman, we decided to restructure the company, and we decided to look at this situation not as a crisis, but as a big chance. When I was younger, I always thought that a crisis is a very, very bad thing. But then, when I entered my first job, I got to know the concept of Kaizen. That's a philosophy of Toyota, which they started after the war, which means nothing else but continuous improvement. And this continuous improvement was mainly based on one philosophy. And this word is a major stone of this philosophy. The Japanese word kiki has two different meanings. So kiki on one hand means danger, and on the other hand, it means opportunity. And this is how Toyota always looked at the business. So whenever there was no external crisis they could come up with, they created the crisis by themselves. Normally, the reaction, and this is part of our DNA, it's a genetic code, is 3 different modes. Whenever you come up or you get into a crisis, it's basically 3 things you do. So number 1 is you start to fight and you start to survive the crisis. The second option you have is you freeze and you try to wait until the crisis is over and nothing actually happens to you. And the third option you have is you run away from this crisis. But what if you would change your perspective on what a crisis actually offers to you? And not every crisis is a crisis, because there are 2 different types of crisis. Number 1 is the self-induced crisis, and I already talked about the self-induced crisis, because you make the active decision in order to jump into this crisis, because you want to get beyond yourself, you want to test out your limits, and it's your decision to enter in this crisis. The second one is the exogenous crisis. It's unforeseen, you did not ask for it, nevertheless, there's a lot of opportunity for you to even grow in a crisis you have not asked for. But especially when it comes to crisis you did not ask for, there's a lot of morale and a lot of confidence getting lost on the way. If you look at this change curve, First, you are in shock. You don't know what to do. You have not expected this to happen. The situation is absolutely new to you. Then you get into a phase of denial. You probably say, well, it looks like a crisis. It feels like a crisis. Probably it is a crisis, but we don't know how this is going to end. Probably it'll be over soon. And after the phase of denial, you get angry. Because you get to a point where you say, what is this crisis doing to me? Why did this crisis actually choose me? What did I do wrong in order to be affected by this crisis? And after you recognize that being angry doesn't make any sense, you start to negotiate with yourself. You start to, okay, what's the best strategy for me to somehow get out of the crisis? So you get closer to the depression, because at a certain point in time you see that, okay, no matter how much I try to negotiate with myself, it's heterogeneous, I cannot change the different factors, so I need to somehow cope with it. And once you get to the lowest point of your morale and your confidence, you actually see the turnaround, and you get to a point of acceptance. And once there is acceptance, there is integration. You start to identify yourself with the crisis, and you start to see more opportunity than danger within this crisis. Problem is, exogenous crises, they give you the same amount of improvement if you deal with it properly, but it takes a lot of time. And it takes a lot of energy. And it takes a lot of courageous behavior in order to cope with it. But if you redefine a crisis, and you do not wait for the heterogeneous crisis, because you decide yourself actively to create your own crises all the time, you get to a situation where you see a shortcut. And once you have the shortcut, you don't have these bad phases of this change curve, because you only have the acceptance phase and the integration phase. And this concept does not only apply to you as a person, it always applies to a company too. If you look at large change activities or large restructuring projects, the whole organization goes through the exact same phases as you would do once you get into a crisis. So the question is there an opportunity for us to change your DNA, the DNA of all of your employees, and thereby the DNA of the whole company, to jump into exogenous crisis, directly into the self-induced crisis, and take this as your new way forward? Because growth is on the way up, it's not on the summit. Nevertheless, you need to know where you want to go. And in order to really cope with a crisis, you need to have a plan. Because having the crisis, having the idea of where you would end up to, having the peak defined, you still need to have a strategy in order to get there. Especially if you decide for yourself to jump in any crisis you see just to improve. And when I started out my career back in 2004, I did not only get to know the concept of Kiki, and I did not only get to know that basically to improve, I can wait that something is happening to me, or life is happening to me, or I can choose to put myself into this self-induced crisis by purpose. And I did this basically from one job into the other. So I always jumped 2 levels above my competence level, and this meant to me that I always had to come up with a strategy to actually survive this self-induced crisis. How did I survive it? I got to know the concept of the T profile. It's from an American consulting company. So whenever they hire people, they look at the T profile to better understand the profile of the candidate, and then they try to develop the candidate in order to have a nice T, and it is consistent with two different aspects. So number one, it's the generalist. So this means that it's things you know a little, put it that way. You don't know too much about it, but you do have a basic understanding of what you are talking about. And on the other hand, it's the specialist. It's the root of your competence, and the more you are specialist in something, the easier it is for you to get into the profile of a generalist, because whenever you struggle with something new, you can always pull yourself back into this competence you have as a specialist and try to take it from there. In my case, the specialist part was lean management. I learned it from the scratch. I learned it by heart. I still use it every day. Lean management is very, very simple. Lean management means nothing else but separating value-adding activities from waste. And whenever you see waste, you can either avoid it or you can optimize it. So whatever situation I look at, I always try to find the value-adding part, and then I try to understand what on the way to this is waste, which I can avoid, and what is waste I cannot avoid, but I can improve. And you can apply this concept not only to processes, because this is basically where it comes from, you can also apply it to strategy. For example, if you consider what's the value-adding part of a strategy, well, most of the time, it's a very, very narrow strategy. It's a less complex strategy. It's stupid and simple. And once you have a very, very clear strategy, which is not too complex, you find it easier in order to introduce this strategy into your organization, because the less strategic complexity you have, the less organizational complexity you need. And once you don't have the organizational complexity, it's much more easy for you to have lean processes which you can automate and then actually have a better business. But this is not enough. The question is, how do you execute it? And you need to have an execution plan, because the best strategy, and this applies to your personal life, or this applies to any kind of business you would want to change, execution is king. And for example, when it comes to many companies I took over as a CEO, there have been tons of ideas, there have been tons of different strategies. Problem is, there has not been enough execution. And this is the model I always looked at. I tried to prepare myself as good as I could. I tried to act as fast as I could. I reflected and then started to prepare for the next step again. In order to set a new standard, first you have to understand where you are and what the situation is you start from. After you define your starting point, you need to understand where you really would want to go, not to say what you will become. For example, if you would want to be a bodybuilder, straightforward example probably, you really need to know what you would want to look like in, let's say, 3 years of time. And you really need to visualize it. You really need to understand what is the amount of fat I am accepting in my body, what's the size I really would want to get. And once you have this target situation, you do nothing else but you break it down into the different steps. And you start from where you would want to be, and then you calculate backwards. And you try to put it in steps that apply to your strategy, which is nothing else but bringing in the things you know as a specialist and the things you learn, in this case, for example, from YouTube or other sources. And once you get to this new standard, you will find it hard to roll back. Because once you manifest this standard, you are closer to the target, even though you are not there. And this again goes back to the idea of Kaizen, which means nothing else but improvement in small steps. And once you get to this new step, you start the engine again. It is a continuous process, it's not a project. And this is how we look at the company Mister Spex today. We will not have a restructuring after a restructuring. We will change the DNA of the company into a DNA of continuous improvement. And to me, the step into the CEO position was nothing else but putting myself into a crisis, because I wanted to grow. It was a great situation for me in my last jobs. Nevertheless, I saw that after 4 to 5 years, I got bored. I did not get bored because there have not been a lot of things to do, but these things were not challenging enough for me in order to keep up with the speed of my own growth. And this is why I had to change jobs. Nevertheless, you need to know what you do. It needs to be a calculated risk. So do not only define the target, do not only define the plan, but always be the master of your own crisis. Thank you.